Hi, welcome back to Chem with Go. This is part 2 of the conversion factor series videos. And before we get into the conversions from a base unit to a prefix unit or from a prefix unit to a base unit, let me just go ahead and take a look at these two fractions and multiply them out. Again, the logic of using conversion factors is to be able to cancel out the units as you go along and ultimately end to what you're trying to get to. For example, if I have these two fractions, you know that if I have a common factor in the numerator and the denominator, I can go ahead and cancel those out. And the answer to this is 1/3. And that's the kind of logic that we're trying to establish right here for conversion factors. Some of your conversion factor calculations may take up like the width of the board or maybe even the width of a page and maybe even go on to the next line. It all depends on what kind of problems you guys are sort of working on, especially when we're taking a look at laboratory calculations in my class. So again, the logic of this again is to be able to cancel out units as you go along and ultimately lead to your final answer. All right, so now let's do this. Let's take a look at a set of conversion factors. Let's take a look at what kilo is. Okay, so if I have kilo, and kilo actually is a prefix that stands for 1,000. Or 10 to the third. Okay. Now, if I have 1 kilometer, kilometers, km, I want to know how many meters this is. Well, the definition of kilo means 1,000, and if you're quick to figure this out, that means it's 1,000 meters. But let's go ahead and use a definition over here of kilo in our calculation. So let's write that out. If I have 1 kilometer, I'm going to use this definition again, the one I have underlined in red, in a fraction form. And it doesn't matter which one goes on top or on the, well, actually, let me start that over. It does matter what you put on the top or on the bottom because you want to set it up in such a way that you can cancel out the units and end up with meters at the end because that's what we're trying to get to over here. So if I have 1 kilometer, and I know that kilo means 1,000, that means it's 1,000 meters. And really all I'm doing, again, is I'm using the definition of kilo, okay, right there. And really, that's just 1 times 1,000, so that makes it 1,000. All right, cool. Or you can just say 10 to the third. Again, the setup for conversion factors is in such a way that it's a logical sort of progression to get to the units for your final answer, and that you can cancel out the units as you go along. And it's a great way for you to be able to check and see and make sure that you've done the calculations correctly or you set it up correctly, because then ultimately it just becomes a calculator problem. And what I mean by calculator problem, you just plug it into your calculator and then out comes the answer. And then remember that you have to take into account your significant figures. All right, we'll take a look at another conversion factor in the next video.